Guys, I have a good intro for this week, but I'm going to waste it now that Eric's not here because you're not going to have any clue what it's about, you two.
Oh.
Eric will know. Maybe some of the listeners will know. Hello, and welcome to the Pill Pod, a show where a bunch of us nerdy-ass PhDs come together to discuss critical theory and philosophy. We are indeed the only turn-based philosophy podcast on the internet. And today, I have to adjust here. We were going to discuss power, and we're going to do kind of a series on power that's going to move into neo-Marxism a little bit. I think we're going to get Borna for that. What do you guys think about him coming
I love that.
I don't know. So sounds
Borna's
cool.
a really
I've
nice
heard good
dude,
things.
and he's surprisingly down to earth for Hegelian, right?
That's always the critique, right? And yeah, in terms of knowledge of the Hegel to Marx move, which is not just a move that just all of a sudden happened, of course, he's very knowledgeable in that space. Because we don't want to do no sophomore Marxism here.
No.
So we need our experts.
Borna's the kind of person who basically is able to unpack like the science of logic or Das Kapital like page by page. So if we wanted to talk about that, he would definitely be somebody we should get on.
All right, so look forward to Borna. Almost done his PhD on left Hegel, something left Hegel. And we're gonna have to figure out time zone because he's in London, I think.
Yeah, he's at in the United Kingdom.
Dude, don't dox him.
Oh cool. Shit, yeah.
I'll ask him before I put this up. So we had this great episode set up. Then a huge storm hit Toronto. Now our lights are flickering. I got a warning saying your internet might be unstable. And Eric has been eliminated. He's been killed.
Struck by lightning.
We're hoping not for a total party kill here. So I had given you all roles in our turn-based philosophy podcast. We have radical left inquisitor, Paladin, Matt McManus.
Yeah, who's that?
He's back from the wars with the alt-right, looking for an adventure. Eric was the Circle of Signs druid, returning from the mountain to warn us of impending ecological collapse, like Zarathustra.
Oh, wow. Nice.
And Victor, you are hostage negotiator, politics guy of the bard class because you have a rich, sexy voice and very high charisma.
That's funny.
Wait, Pels, what does that make you then?
I'm the GM.
Yeah, what
I'm
are
the
you?
GM.
Oh, okay.
No, you're gonna get tied up in my state apparatus, and I'm gonna do whatever I want to you.
Now wait a second here. I thought we were anti-turn based.
That episode never came out, if you remember.
Oh, right. Okay.
So if you didn't hear us last week, it's because we released our first Patreon only episode, and we have Patreons.
Yeah, which is patrons.
Oh, patrons. Sorry. Yeah, when we recorded the episode, we had no patrons, and now we do have patrons. So you're
That's
still
cool.
going to get at least, probably 3 times a month free content here, and then the other half of that's going to be behind the Patreon wall. If this is your thing, if it's not, don't worry about it. If you're happy with the scraps that you're being given,
They're giving good stuff.
yeah, I think so. We're gonna bounce back and forth between there and here.
And as a big podcast listener, I can say that I've never been a patron, so I respect all people who just want free things because I want free things. But for those of you who are patrons, that's awesome.
And we're gonna say the stuff on Patreon that we don't.
Patreon.
Okay, sorry, Patreon. We're going to say the things on the Patreon that our bosses can't hear, that our employers will never find out about. So, if that's some incentive, there you go.
Yeah, we can really let loose on those Patreon episodes.
Speaking of listeners, are you guys interested in hearing where our listeners are from? Because I could open up the stats here.
I'd love to know where they're from and how many we have had in the last couple episodes.
Oh, they're going up. They're like each one kind of goes up as another one goes up. So
that's good.
If we do country breakdown, I can even do like states breakdown. But
oh wow, this is cool. Really? Tell us some cool facts.
Especially because we were shitting on the South last week.
Yeah, I'm curious. Did we have any Southern listeners for that episode?
I actually got a response from a Southern listener who was, let's say, and he was he's actually an acquaintance that in my personal life. So he listened to it. And he mostly agreed with it, sounded like, but he also said that we were kind of buying into a media narrative about the mainstream media presenting the South constantly as a race war. When he says, when you live here, it doesn't actually feel like that. So, I mean, that's good critique of a critical theory podcast. We can critique ourselves. Yes, most of what we know about the South, or at least I can speak for myself, what I know about the South comes from the news and the elections. And, most of what you hear about the South is, oh, yeah, they elected another pedophile or screwed over a teachers union or something like that.
Or just want immigrants to go away.
To be fair to Alabama, they didn't actually elect Roy Moore. They almost elected Roy Moore.
They were considering it carefully.
Deeply considering it. But I will also say that perhaps the divide is more accurately like a rural-urban divide, because I think like maybe this is what your listener was pointing to, that obviously like if you're in a southern city, like it's not at all what we're describing, right? If you're in Dallas or if you're in
he specifically
Memphis
is from
or whatever,
Houston now, but he also lived in one of the Carolinas for a while. So, I mean, he's got much more personal experience for us. But he said the thing we got most right was the renegade. And the reason that they're so distrustful of government and, building bomb shelters or whatever is because they think the North is going to come back. They're on their way back. It's just a matter of time.
So that's fun. That's pretty funny. That would have been the thing that maybe I would have expected to not be true.
Yeah. I have a buddy of mine from Texas, actually. He was in my PhD program. Very smart guy, I should say. But yeah, he used to say the same thing, right? If you go into like rural Texas, his family, is dark skinned, right? People will look at you funny and like there's a little bit of animosity. But he said the weird thing is people in Houston almost overcompensate for the image Texas has internationally by being like ultra liberal, right? Like
that's one thing Victor, the other Victor, said last week was they have an image problem, and then some people try to overcode that image problem by being extra saccharine, right?
Well, and the revisionist history about the Civil War. Yeah. Right.
Okay, so we don't hate the South. Just stop electing.
No, I love the South. I have
the people that you constantly elect.
So, what other have you gotten any other feedback from about that episode or no?
No. I don't always check the comments that we get, but anyway, looking at the stats, since we're talking about it, I can just click on here. I'll click on US here.
Like, what is the majority in terms of countries?
For sure, the top four are United States, Canada, Australia, UK.
Okay, cool.
As you would expect, they're the wealthiest English-speaking countries. Next is Germany, and next is India, which Well,
that's interesting. There's a lot of English speakers though there, so
yeah, there's probably more English speakers there than there are in Canada, and probably Canada and Australia combined,
and probably also more than the United States, probably actually.
That's a good point. Yeah, I mean, I didn't really know, but we could look that up. But I imagine there's got to be tens of millions of people who speak English.
If you include English as a second language spoken well, I guarantee you India has more English speakers than.
Well,
the
even
US.
if you have a conservative estimate of 10%, that's still like 100 million people.
That's still 130 million or something like that.
Yeah.
Germany is our highest non-majority English country on here.
Cool.
Netherlands, hop. Philippines, Brazil, Sweden, Greece. And then after that, it kind of goes into sub 1%.
Wow, that's interesting.
It's bad. I'll have to do better to promote in Mexico.
Yeah.
And then when you break down the actual, our top two, which is US, Canada, majority of, surprisingly perhaps, California, considering we're a Canadian podcast. Second is New York, but these go by population. Illinois, Texas, Michigan. And then, we even got we got one in South Carolina, 3 in Georgia.
There you go.
So sorry for shitting on you, but Florida.
Is this all for specifically the America podcast episode?
No. This is the entire thing. So they've heard us at one point.
Okay.
In Canada, we have BC, Quebec, Ontario represented well. Not a single listener in Saskatchewan or Manitoba.
Oh, wow.
Which is fine because we don't want them anyway. But
what about Alberta?
Oh, yeah, we got some Alberta. They probably just,
what about the Maritimes?
They probably just tune in to hear us shit on Trudeau.
Yeah, maybe.
Maritimes, only Nova Scotia, actually.
Okay.
So
probably somebody at Dell.
We're growing. We're small.
But how many listeners overall do we have so far, like in our episodes? I mean, it's probably still in the hundreds, right? Like
per episode, we're reaching 4,000 total.
Per episode.
Most episodes are between 400 or 500.
Cool. That's pretty good.
That's pretty cool.
It's not bad.
Yeah, so
not bad.
Thanks for listening wherever you're from. We appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. I have a random question for Matt. Actually, I'm curious because he was mentioning I got to do better to promote this podcast in Mexico. So you'll be starting to teach. Will you tell your students that you're on a podcast or not? I'm curious about that decision.
Yeah, no, I probably will. I mean, the university that I was at in Mexico used to encourage me to talk to my students about like any kind of interviews I was doing or books. I mean, they didn't have to listen and it wasn't extra credit or something, since that would be pretty self-serving. But I don't know. I always like tell them, like, look, if you're interested in whatever it is that I'm doing or whatever it is that we're talking about here, there are ways to explore it more thoroughly. So come and support the Pill Pod.
Yeah, cool.
There are some things we say that could be interpreted negatively by employers, particularly.
Yeah, that's what I mean. We'll have to be more careful on the non-Patreon episodes.
And once you're even trying to advance a little bit, they kind of go through your profile to find out, oh, is this person going to get canceled in like 10 years?
Yeah.
We might get canceled in 10 years.
Oh, God, maybe.
Speaking of canceling,
for saying what?
Do you want to do that?
Yeah.
Not get canceled, but check out the cancel article, or do you want to talk about the other podcast first?
I think we could talk about the cancel article first and then move on to that. I mean, the two are related, but this is kind of fresh meat.
All right. So generally today, I mean, we had this whole plan. That plan's still going to happen. We're going to talk about Foucault versus neo-Marxism versus Deleuze, because we've done some Deleuze content lately. Talk about state and power. But since Eric's missing, our druid, and he's particularly fond of Foucault, we are instead just going to shoot the shit today and hope that you enjoy it. Of course, we're going to keep with our theory, philosophy, but we're going to look at some more pop culture stuff because we're trying to fit ourselves into a niche. And the thing about being an academic while you're in school, as you still are, Victor, and I'm sure you don't know anything that's going on. Like you resurface from your dissertation research and like you don't know anything that's happened in the last 3-4 years. So I'm just learning right now about the alt-right because I know about Jordan Peterson. Everyone does, of course. He's our dad. So, of course, we know him quite well. But there's all these other guys like the Shapiro and the who's the really flamboyant guy? He got canceled, but he used...
I don't know if I would put him in...
No,
I think he's talking about like that guy with like the bleach blonde hair who he was like an editor for Breitbart.
He was a Breitbart guy. And then
Milo Yiannopoulos is the one. And what ended up happening with him is he made some comments about how when he was younger, like really young, 14, 15, 13, he slept with a bunch of men and it was a good formative experience for him. So Breitbart was willing to tolerate the Nazi stuff and the racism. But when he seemed to be implicitly endorsing homosexual pedophilia, that was the line they drew.
Yeah, totally.
Well,
totally.
At least we know they have a line. Who would have known?
I wouldn't have thought either, but that was where it is.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily put him in the same box as Peterson, but yeah, sort of related-ish.
I think that's a mistake. The reason that we pick on Peterson, and he's never gonna listen to this, obviously, but the reason we feel like he's our rival is because, first of all, he's an academic. Second of all, he's from Toronto. And third, this is our jouissance. If we want to put it in psychoanalytic terms, we want to separate him from his objective desire because we actually have the same objective desire, which is being like recognized for your intellectual work, except we think his intellectual work is shit, yet he's getting recognized for it. So we're taking pleasure in trying to violate his experience with his own object of desire. There's our jouissance. There's your Lacan for the day. Right.
Yeah, he's been pretty mute for a while though. Of course,
comas do that.
You must have heard about how sick he got, and he was in Russia for a while. I think he actually just went on his daughter's podcast.
He's in Serbia.
Yeah, he's in Serbia. That's it. Yeah. This is a.
He has actually written something recently. I was going to say he published an op-ed in the National Post talking about the controversy over that chemistry teacher at Brock University. I'm not sure if you heard about that.
No, I don't think I did. Maybe you could summarize.
This professor released an article and it included some basically like hits against cancel culture and the way it was that the university was moving from a quote meritocracy to one that was all about trying to include, to focus on diversity and so on and so forth. And Brock basically said, we don't approve of this. And the journal that had accepted the article withdrew it, right? And it was really odd because the article was in chemistry and it was just these kind of random political comments, taking shots at PC culture. But long story short, of course, Peterson wrote in the National Post about how this was a disaster and how, the vultures were swooping in, to try to ruin this guy's academic career. And it's reflective of the broader cultural enemy. And he also compared himself to a Greek prophet, which I always really enjoy. You know who Cassandra is, right?
Yeah. Iliad?
Cassandra?
Yeah. No, she was a prophetess, and she basically warned the Trojans that the Greeks were hiding in the Trojan horse, right? And nobody listened to her because she'd been cursed to utter the truth about the future and have no one listen by the gods. And of course, Troy fell and there was all that kind of stuff, right? But yeah, Peterson has reached the point now where he's comparing himself to people in myth, which might be slightly better than him comparing himself to Christian prophets. I don't really know. But,
I shout in the wilderness and you did not hear me.
So this chemistry professor, so he had to withdraw all that stuff?
Yeah, the journal basically said that they were going to withdraw the article because it wasn't up to their standards, and it also included needless politicization of what was supposed to be a chemistry piece, right?
Right, which is kind of interesting, kind of funny that he did that.
Yeah, I mean...
It was to a chemistry journal?
He did. Yeah, it's about a chemistry, but the examples he used or something were like shots at PC culture?
Yeah, he just included some random comments within the text that was supposed to be about some topics in chemistry, saying things like, well, the university used to be meritocratic, but it's no longer. Now they all focus on diversity hirings, and free speech is increasingly suppressed. The guy is fairly old and crotchety from the sense that I got. I don't know what's going to happen to him. My understanding is that he hasn't faced any kind of actual reprimand from his work beyond a couple of the officials saying, like, we don't consider this behavior acceptable. And I don't imagine he will actually face any more serious reprimand than that. And, having his article get canceled. But
I mean, that's the thing, right? They scream bloody murder and actually nothing substantial happens to these people almost ever. It's just like people calling you names on Twitter and obscure Canadian podcasts calling you a dipshit. Some people do end up like, maybe this guy, nothing happened to him, but some people, I guess, have been like fired for various things. But it's not like it's not like a endemic, like very common.
No, I mean, I'm not particularly fond of woke culture, right? For a lot of reasons. And I do think that there's a problem with its overprevalence at the university. I also do think that these commentators who suggest that it's somehow a mortal threat to Western civilization aren't just overstating their case.
I agree.
They're kind of...
That's exactly right.
Almost overstating it to the point of comedy, right? Like where you think like, this is, a minuscule little problem that you've somehow transformed into something tantamount to the emergence of fascism or Soviet communism or whatever, right? And it's almost...
conspiracy brain, right?
Yeah.
Well, to some extent, it almost seems like both sides, like both extremes, right? The ones who think it's like a huge problem, maybe like the most woke, like they kind of use each other to sustain their own sort of fantasy, oppositional fantasy that they're like fighting the good fight. So I think both have an interest in making the problem seem worse to some extent for their own sort of jouissance, to bring it back to Lacan in a way.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I mean, Warner could talk a bit more about this next week, right? But there certainly is a kind of dialectical antagonism between the two. Although in this case, it's much more of a conscious dialectic, right? Where one side deliberately tries to antagonize and inflame the other to rile up attention for themselves. And then the other side responds in kind, right?
Yeah, for sure. Actually, maybe that's a good time I could bring up this Harper's letter on justice and open debate.
Yeah, rather than speaking in generalities, we have this open letter signed by presumably important people. And what happened there?
So like this letter was released and signed by a bunch of pretty famous authors and academics, including Margaret Atwood, Noam Chomsky. I don't know who else is on here. Like a bunch of people. Some of these names I don't recognize because they're like literature. I don't know, Francis Fukuyama, Malcolm Gladwell.
Oh, yeah. J.K. Rowling.
Gloria
J.K.
Steinem.
Rowling's pissed for getting canceled.
J.K. Rowling. Yeah, a bunch of people. So I don't know. It's only 3 paragraphs. You haven't read it yet, though.
No, I haven't. But that's a strange assortment of literati. So just for me and anyone else, why don't you explain it from the beginning?
Oh, do you think I should? Well, it's only 3 paragraphs. Do you want me to just read it and then you can react in the moment?
Sure. We've already talked about how you
because you got the sexy voice.
Okay.
You got to read it dramatically, richly.
That's what I was just going to say. Yeah, you got that sexy magisterial voice. Let's hear it.
Apparently, this is the first I've heard of it, but okay, I will
Go
do my
Bard.
best. Okay, so this was published on July 7th. So yesterday, we're recording this on the 8th right now, a letter on justice and open debate. So it starts. Our cultural institutions are facing a moment of trial. Powerful protests for racial and social justice are leading to overdue demands for police reform, along with wider calls for greater equality and inclusion across our society, not least in higher education, journalism, philanthropy, and the arts. But this needed reckoning has also intensified a new set of moral attitudes and political commitments that tend to weaken our norms of open debate and toleration of differences in favor of ideological conformity.
So what I've heard so far is we're in touch, but don't worry, we're really out of touch. Okay, sorry.
As we applaud the first development, we also raise our voices against the second. The forces of illiberalism are gaining strength throughout the world and have a powerful ally in Donald Trump, who represents a real threat to democracy. But resistance must not be allowed to harden into its own brand of dogma or coercion, which right-wing demagogues are already exploiting. The democratic inclusion we want can be achieved only if we speak out against the intolerant climate that has set in on all sides. The free exchange of information and ideas, the lifeblood of a liberal society, is daily becoming more constricted. Will we have come to expect this on the radical right? Censoriousness is also spreading more widely in our culture, an intolerance of opposing views, a vogue for public shaming and ostracism, and the tendency to dissolve complex policy issues into a blinding moral certainty.
Just to interrupt a bit, like this is just a refrain of, you hear all these words in this order all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
But is this people's experience actually changing, or is it just because these people are on Twitter all day?
I think you're right. I think you're right that being on Twitter certainly it like intensifies and magnifies the experience. I mean, it makes things seem worse than they are, but I also think that there has been some sort of a shift as well. I think it's a bit of both. I don't know what you think.
Have you experienced this in like your life?
No, I mean, in academia, I hang around with academics, but I mean, probably not with my non-academic friends too much. I don't know. Matt, what do you think?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think one of the reasons why this has assumed so much attention recently is the stakes are a lot higher for some of these people, right? Unlike public broadcasters or even academia, directly academia, I should say, people like Twitter, like our forums like Twitter or Facebook, create their own rules and they respond to public pressure, right? So if you are able to actually create a campaign that gets enough momentum to cancel someone, that can have a serious financial impact on them, as well as an impact on their ability to disseminate information, right? I mean, if you want a good example, this Milo Yiannopoulos is one that I actually took some satisfaction of, because he was booted off a lot of these mediums, and now he's complaining that he's basically penniless, right? He lost all of his sources of income. And to be fair, he deserved that for being a racist Nazi, right? But, you know, I can understand why people are concerned about this since the stakes are really high for a lot of them. Do I think that this is a big problem beyond the kind of digital public sphere? Let's call it that. Yeah, I mean, every stereotype usually has some basis in truth, right? And if you spend enough time in academia, of course, you'll meet people who kind of configure to a lot of these kinds of liberal and right-wing stereotypes, right? I knew when I was doing my PhD someone who would take issue if you're a white dude listening to rap, for example, right? And I remember I was telling her about how I was listening to Kendrick Lamar or something. She's like, well, you have no experience with that. I'm like, oh, really? I'm not a dude, selling crack in New York City and, come on.
Hey, LA,
come on.
LA.
Yeah.
In LA, yeah. But like,
at least we know you listen to Kendrick Lamar, so it's confirmation that you're not racist, because those things are incompatible.
Hey, no, he's fantastic, right? Yeah, absolutely. No, but so if you look hard enough, you can find these kind of stereotypes, and I do definitely think that there's sometimes pressure to conform to a certain kind of ultra woke expectation. Did I ever feel like I wasn't able to speak my mind in an academic setting? I would say no, right? Certainly not directly, right? And would I feel like I would not be able to speak my mind if I were a tenured professor like a lot of the people who speak most vehemently on this issue are? No, I don't think so, right? And I think one of the ironies is people like Jordan Peterson or Stephen Hicks or Gad Saad, who constantly come back to this issue, far from being silenced, are amongst the most vocal people in the entire world, right? So I do think it's a problem. No, I'm saying I do think it's a problem, and it's something that we should address. And I also think it has a debilitating impact on the left, because a lot of people fixate on the kind of most annoying features of left-wing activism, and they're turned off by it, right? But I also don't think it's nearly as big a problem as a lot of these right-wing individuals try to make it out to be.
My thought about this has to do with solicitation of opinions, because if I'm in an academic environment and my opinion is unsolicited, then there's no requirement for me to give it. But it sounds like what these people are saying is I should be able to give my opinion on all things at all times, regardless of who's present. And when you take that into the internet, it just doesn't make sense, because on Twitter, that room is everybody. But to me, this really reeks of, their moral indignation that people are not soliciting their opinions anymore. And how dare someone come to question my judgment? I'll have you know, I am an esteemed member of the intelligentsia.
Yeah.
Did we just lose? We just lost Victor.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think he just disappeared.
Well, we were afraid this was going to happen, that the storm would knock out our communications. But yeah,
well, let's carry on for a couple minutes, and then hopefully he'll come back.
I could keep reading the article because I just opened it while he was talking. But I mean, yeah, I consider this to be a little bit silly in the sense that they just assume that their opinion has to be heard all the time by all people, whereas seriously, it looks like materially and physically, a lot of people have been, minorities particularly, have been barred entry from these spaces intentionally. And that's not at all what's happening. This isn't like the reverse of that. It might be an overcompensation. It might be a pendulum swing. But, I really see this as a classist document. And it's not a class as in like bourgeoisie proletariat, but this literati class that is upset that people are in their space and that people are telling them to control their volume, I guess. Yeah,
I mean, and there's often a kind of implicit conservative bias, because a lot of these people don't like to admit their own political propensities when it comes to a lot of these debates about political correctness in the curricula, right? And there's this argument that, we need to teach people about, the fundamental text of Western civilization. And if we don't do that, they're not getting an education that's worthy of the name. And my kind of response to that is, well, why do you think that, right? I mean, you could learn a great deal from Confucius that you would also get in Aristotle. But if you decide to swap out Aristotle for Confucius, you also get the added benefit of having students who have some familiarity with Chinese philosophy now, right? And you can complement that by making sure that they read Plato so they have some familiarity with Greek philosophy also, right? If you're looking at 20th century literature and you swap out George Orwell for Chinua Achebe, right? Things fall apart. Again, would you be losing something? Certainly everyone should read Orwell, but then everyone should also read Achebe as well, right? And people don't really have a lot of good arguments against this, except to cry foul, and then often try to implicitly imply that, these works from other cultures are substandard. They're just not as good as what we produce.
I don't even think that's what this letter's saying, though. The letter on justice and open debate. To me, it just looks, if you scan the list of names at the bottom, these are just...
All right, I'm back. I'm back.
Well, we need you to finish. We need you to finish reading. But
okay, I'd like to finish reading.
We were talking about your opinions being solicited, and these people on this list, it looks like to me, have forever had their opinions solicited.
Now,
you're pausing.
Okay, here we go. I think are you guys still
and these
there?
are the people whose opinions are suddenly not being solicited, and they tend to be, boomer famous people.
Yeah, I just want to finish up by saying the reason I brought up curriculum and kind of what appears on them on the curricula, right, is because it's indicatory of the more general mindset these people have, right, which is that oftentimes they try to present their concern as just being about freedom of speech and trying to make sure that every side is heard. And a lot of the authors in this letter, I think that's exactly what they're trying to do, and I commend them for that, right? But for many people who invoke this kind of rhetoric, what they're trying to do is push an implicitly conservative agenda, usually one that has very problematic elements.
And maybe not
like what I just talked about.
Maybe not conservative, but just center, normative. They want to maintain normalcy. And Trump freaks everybody out.
But I think Matt's right, though, that there are some people who are using, and that's what makes it difficult to, maybe you guys were talking about this when my internet cut out, but like that's sort of what makes it difficult to like fully agree, because that some people are using this sort of like anti-wokeness as a cover to really like push through their more conservative like agendas a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And the thing is, I have no problem with freedom of speech and freedom of expression and trying to allow as much dialogue and as many opinions as possible, right? And I think that's a very progressive standpoint. And I do find it really frustrating that some on the political left don't actually share that opinion, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's damaging to progressive causes. And not only is it damaging, but it paints us all with a negative brush, right?
Yeah.
Which you have to extricate yourself from.
Yeah.
In saying that, I also don't think that a lot of the people who push for this kind of rhetoric are all that interested in freedom of speech and dialogue for its own sake. Rather, they use these as a cover to try to advance their own kind of agenda. Because if they were put in positions of authority, they would probably try as best they could to marginalize or silence a lot of the voices that oppose them.
Which is always this thing like,
sure.
Sorry, what's it called? They said it in the article, I'm pretty sure, Western culture, this amalgam of, the best and brightest that the world has ever produced. This is the thing we have to defend. It's under threat. Like, come on.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think so. Actually, maybe I should read a little bit more here because I think they start getting more specific about the kind of consequences they're worried about. Okay, so they say here, okay, we uphold the value of robust and even caustic counter speech from all quarters, but it is now all too common to hear calls for swift and severe retribution in response to perceived transgressions of speech and thought. More troubling still, institutional leaders, in a spirit of panicked damage control, are delivering hasty and disproportionate punishments instead of considered reforms. Editors are fired for running controversial pieces. Books are withdrawn for alleged inauthenticity. Journalists are barred from writing on certain topics. Professors are investigated for quoting works of literature in class. A researcher is fired for circulating a peer-reviewed academic study, and the heads of organizations are ousted for what are sometimes just clumsy mistakes. Whatever the arguments around each particular incident, the result has been to steadily narrow the boundaries of what can be said without the threat of reprisal. We are already paying the price in greater risk aversion among writers, artists, and journalists who fear for their livelihoods if they depart from the consensus or even lack sufficient zeal in agreement.
Man, this is just the baldest declaration of self-interest. I'm afraid that my book deal is in jeopardy, so you all have to change. Although, not to be just too contrarian here, there's definitely something to that term disproportionate response in some cases, at least. Probably not to any of these people, but for those with less of a platform to defend themselves, saying something they probably didn't mean in context.
Mistake. In fact, I would say that gets to the core of like my biggest problem with so-called cancel culture is like that it's sometimes in like its more extreme forms is overly preoccupied with, I guess, what I would maybe call a logic of retribution.
Punitive, right.
Like about, which I don't like. I just don't agree with retribution on any side. That's why like this could be a totally different conversation. I'm basically a prison abolitionist. Like, so I don't believe in retribution as like a logic for making society better in any circles. So I don't think that like firing somebody, obviously it's a different situation completely. Like, I don't want to get into a whole thing about prison abolition, but like just in general, I don't agree with that logic of punishment for like things that are disproportionate. I think that like if we want to make people buy into ideas, sort of a mindset of retribution is the wrong way to go. So yeah, when people get fired or silenced or whatever, yes, it's not like some criminal penalty, but it still seems like a disproportionate penalty for something that is, like, as you said, pills could be a pretty small mistake. I mean, what comes to mind in Canada is, I mean, this might have been a bigger mistake. I actually haven't followed up on the story, but there's this Canadian journalist, Wendy Mesley. I don't know if you guys heard about this. CBC journalist. Apparently she like used the N-word during a meeting. I don't know if it's, I don't know if it's true to like, I don't know if it was true that she said she was quoting something, and yeah, like that's a mistake. Shouldn't do that.
I think it was Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, wasn't it? It was something like that.
Yeah, it was something like you shouldn't repeat the word, whatever. But like a lot of people were calling for her to be fired. And I think I actually listened to another Canadian podcast that's about media criticism, Canada Land. I don't know if you guys know it or familiar. Jesse Brown. Yeah,
I've heard of that.
Yeah, he had this journalist, Desmond Cole, who's like a well-known, I guess you could say a little bit on the more woke side. And he was on discussing what they in that podcast, instead of calling it cancel culture, Desmond Cole was arguing to rename it consequence culture. And he was sort of arguing, well, yes, there are consequences for doing things. But in that episode, he was, in my opinion, a little bit unreasonable and was calling Wendy Mesley like a racist disgrace. And, and Jesse Brown, the host, was asking him, well, what is, if she just made a mistake in this one incident, like we should talk about what the proportionate response is. And he was kind of like, well, why is it my job as a black person to like decide these things? And like, she's a racist disgrace, like end of story. Yeah, he said this on the podcast. And I was just like, okay, that's like a little bit.
Obviously, we don't know what was said, but proportional punishment definitely has to take context into account, especially if she's quoting Dr. King.
Yeah. So I actually haven't followed up on the Wendy Mesley story. So I don't know if it came out that it was actually worse, but she was initially saying that it was really just something that she was quoting. She was quoting someone else during a meeting. And there was a person of color in the meeting who took great offense, and it became like a larger controversy. And I don't know if she's going to get fired, but that was sort of what a lot of people were calling for.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing that this article entirely leaves out is that this is not like state infringement on the right, the freedom of speech. Really, these are brands, journals, publishers, news networks, schools, seeking the response that's correct in the eyes of their consumers. So ultimately, these signatories are complaining about market decisions.
Right. But
and the only thing you can really do to curb market decisions is legislate. So I guess the subtext of this letter is that the state protect them from their own employers.
Actually, that's what I wanted to say. And it's where I think actually this becomes most problematic, because I don't like the idea of private and particularly market actors trying to regulate people for behavior they engage in their private lives, right? I think that's a really worrying extension of the kind of logic of the market into interpersonal relations. And this isn't to say that I think we should let people off the hook for making racist statements in everyday life, or that we should somehow say, well, just say whatever you want, have a free-for-all, and there should be no consequences. I completely agree with that. What was the name of the journalist you mentioned?
It was Desmond Cole.
Yeah. And I think there is a sense that people have gotten away for too long with saying bullshit racist stuff without there being consequence.
Sure.
And that's probably why there's a lot of this virulence now. Saying all that, though, I don't like the idea of working for wherever it happens to be, Walmart or college or university or, Amazon, saying some things at a bar one night to a friend of mine, having someone record it, and then all of a sudden I lose my job because of that. Because as Pills, I was saying, the company is brand conscious and doesn't want to be associated with that.
But I think it's the important detail too about the brand consciousness, and I absolutely agree with both of you that. But I think these are private market actors. But I think what this letter actually gets right is that the brand consciousness is motivated by fear, right? Because like the Twitter sphere has magnified certain voices, so that like a company is just terrified that there's going to be some like viral Twitter like story about how they, defended this employee who was a racist, right? And even if it was something.
Yeah. Like, we're not going to boycott you for union busting or having like predatory corporate practices or maximizing profits over the interests of your employees' health insurance. But if you have a racist employee, no, then you're fucking done.
Right. So So their fear is obviously making them make decisions that are maybe disproportionate to what actually happened. And that creates a retributive kind of outcome, because people are being disproportionately punished for something that's motivated really by a private corporation's fear of being perceived a certain way because of the magnified discourse on Twitter.
No, but I think that's really right, Vic. I mean, a lot of the problems that we see right now are a consequence of the kind of magnification that you see in digital culture, right? And the reality is that in many of these circumstances, people are able to dogpile on those that they oppose and rally support because it's such an easy thing to do. And the problem with that, of course, is that digital culture doesn't encourage looking at context of statements or commentary or books very extensively. Right? Yeah. You're able to kind of take this little one incident and then say, look at this is bad. And then everyone's going to draw the same kind of opinion from you as long as they follow you in some kind of meaningful way, right?
Exactly.
And I don't think that's even necessarily just a left-wing phenomenon, right? I think that that's true on the political right as well. And the irony is that people like Jordan Peterson or Dave Rubin or Ben Shapiro have all profited from this as well, right? When they sit there and they're like, look at these dumb SJWs on campus, see all the stuff that they do, right? This is why the left is all crazy and you shouldn't pay attention to them. When I think a lot of us are actually willing to have a reasonable discussion with their political opponents and are interested in reaching out. It's just so easy to tar an individual or even tar a whole movement with a single brush by taking one thing out of context and presenting it as emblematic of who that person is or what that movement is about.
It's frustrating for me too. And you, I think, are speaking to this too, Matt. Like both of us are kind of pretty far left, but liberals, both of us, I think, are liberals. And I think that what's frustrating from our perspective is the way this whole rallying cry against woke culture has been taken up by people like Ben Shapiro and Dave Rubin. And it's frustrating because you see people online and maybe even some of our listeners, right, who are maybe attracted to because they like the critiques of the unreasonable wokeness. But so then they'll start liking Ben Shapiro. But what always annoys me about those podcasts and those episodes is that all they do is talk about how annoying the woke left is. But they're never defending their own ideas, which if you actually go and talk about what are Dave Rubin's actual ideas, they're bad from a left-wing liberal perspective. It's you have bad ideas. And all you're doing is critiquing the left for some of their worst examples where we can agree that some of the woke left says things that are unreasonable. But then if we actually turn around and examine your views, Dave Rubin, or your views, Ben Shapiro, you guys have shitty views. And as a left-wing liberal, I want to be able to talk about and critique. And in some ways, I want to even speak specifically to maybe some of our listeners who like those people. And maybe this could even be part of a niche for our podcast is I want to, take some of those people who are maybe like some of the things that Ben Shapiro says, but bring them back to the left and be don't be seduced by their sexy critiques of some of the unreasonableness on the left. And remember that ideas that are actually good and make sense are still on the left.
Yeah, I mean, ContraPoints had a really good video on this recently when she was talking about cringe culture, right? And she talked about how a lot of these anti-social justice activists make an argument from mimicry and mockery, right? Yeah. Where basically, you parrot what one or two social justice activists are saying, and then you mock it. And then people assume that this is just emblematic of what people on the left or even, on the far right, what liberals think. And they say, oh, that's just ridiculous. Why would I ever have to engage with that? And from paragons of reason and logic, this is a pretty superficial way of actually trying to argue against your political opponents. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
And you really see this when they actually have to debate someone who knows what they're talking about, right? When Jordan Peterson had to debate Slavoj Žižek, and Žižek just asked him, well, who are these postmodern neo-Marxists? Name me one. It was I don't know, they're everywhere, right? They're everywhere, then where are they? It's well, they're everywhere, right? They're invisible. Yeah. They exist in the walls between us, listening and policing, what everyone's saying. And the same thing with Ben Shapiro when he went on that podcast, BBC a couple of years ago, right? And somebody asked him, well, don't you think you've contributed to this culture of hyperpartisanship? Given you've written books like How to Debate a Leftist and Destroy Them and so on and so forth. He just got up in a huff and left because he didn't want to have to bother with that, right?
Matt, I'm not accusing you of this because I just saw you do it and our listeners did not. But you said paragons of logic and reason with quotes in your fingers. And yeah, I completely dismiss the right without engaging their ideas. So you guys can do that. You can be the paladin. I'll be the.
But we do that because we both do politics. You didn't spend your PhD studying political theory. I guess,
yeah, that's where your interlocutors have to come from. But I'm trying to get back to the article though. What do they say we should do about this? Because we've talked about private.
I just want to interject 1 second and say it's not that I think that there aren't really intelligent commentators on the political right.
Oh, there are.
I actually think Peterson has some very smart things to say, and I think people like Patrick Deneen or Peter Lawler were brilliant political theorists, for what it's worth.
Yeah.
What I'm talking about are what are sometimes derogatorily called logic bros, right? People who invoke reason and logic quite directly, right, as terms, almost like they're a tantric mantra. And if you just say, I'm reasonable and I'm logical, and I'm reasonable and I'm logical enough, that will make it so. And my kind of argument is, no, right? If you want to be reasonable and logical, then make reasonable and logical arguments and let them stand on their own merits.
And they get this from what is variously known, the intellectual dad web. Or
actually, I'd like to add, I think the paradigmatic example of this is this Stefan Molyneux, right? Who you did debate, Matt. And I think actually I would recommend to our listeners, if they're interested, there's a guy on YouTube who recently debated Stefan Molyneux. And I think he actually managed to get Stefan Molyneux to a point to embarrass himself a little bit in a way that maybe in your debate, there wasn't exactly that opportunity. His name's Rationality Rules. I don't know if you've heard about this guy on YouTube.
I have heard about
Rationality Rules.
Yeah, so his
destroys Stefan Molyneux.
No, so actually his debate was quite good though. I was impressed with him and basically got Stefan Molyneux to the point where he was I don't want to talk about this. This is boring. Let's change topics. When he was beating him clearly, it was pretty funny.
That is funny.
So what is this? David Brooks, Matt Iglesias, Harry Potter author, what do they say we should do about it?
Okay, so there's a final short paragraph. So they say, this stifling atmosphere will ultimately harm the most vital causes of our time. The restriction of debate, whether by a repressive government or an intolerant society, invariably hurts those who lack power and makes everyone less capable of democratic participation. The way to defeat bad ideas is by exposure, argument, and persuasion, not by trying to silence or wish them away. We refuse any false choice between justice and freedom, which cannot exist without each other. As writers, we need a culture that leaves us room for experimentation, risk-taking, and even mistakes. We need to preserve that possibility of good faith disagreement without dire professional consequences. If we won't defend the very thing on which our work depends, we shouldn't expect the public or the state to defend it for us.
No, but they are asking for the state to defend it for them because these are the publishers and the newspapers and the universities are the ones that are firing them. That's the only real consequence other than being called, a cuck lib or whatever. What are we called by the alt-right? Soy boys? Is this soy boys a thing? All right.
Soy boys.
So we're going to get called a soy boy, boo-hoo. But the people that are firing them are their employers, basically, or the people that are buying their manuscripts. And they're saying we don't want state intervention, but they're asking for state intervention. They want it to be illegal for you to get fired for saying something on Twitter because all they do all day is say things on Twitter. So what are they?
Well, I don't know if they actually want that. They don't say that.
Yeah, I don't know if they call for that.
Well, then what are they doing? They're just giving a manifesto that people are supposed to retweet?
Yeah.
I think they're trying to make an argument. They're trying to contribute to the public dialogue that that they're trying to defend here and say they're trying to persuade other people and maybe persuade publishers or owners to not be scared of the Twitter mob that might try to cancel.
Or they're trying to talk to the Twitter mob, which is a totally useless thing to do because you don't.
I mean, this totally backfired, right? The one thing I heard in reaction to this, and even Eric was sort of speaking to it on our Patreon Discord.
You can subscribe to the Patreon Discord.
Yeah, if you're a patron, then you can be on the Discord and chat with us. He was saying how
I like it.
There's a reaction that there it's he was saying something well, who cares what these rich authors think, they're hypocrites because some of them have apparently called other people out. And I've noticed that that's been someone from like one of my colleagues also sort of repeated something similar. Like they're like, oh, it's funny how like some of the people on this list have called other people out themselves. And I was kind of like, I don't know, like I get it, but I always find the hypocrisy argument like kind of weak. It's like, you know, like who cares if someone's a hypocrite? It's just because Al Gore flies a private jet, right? Like who cares if he's that doesn't say anything about whether climate change we should be worried about it or not, right? And it's like just because some of these people have called people out says nothing about whether calling people out is bad or not.
I know. Hypocrisy, like whataboutism, is one of the thinnest arguments that you can level against someone, right? Because you don't have to engage with the substance of what they're talking about. All you have to do is say, well, this person lacks integrity, so we can now ignore everything that they have to say.
That's exactly. And that's some of the reaction that I've seen on Twitter of this, like maybe one of the more popular reactions to this statement.
Yeah. I mean, I will say this, though. I have called out people for hypocrisy before, right? Because sometimes it does just become so glaring and so much fun to observe that
of
it's
course.
Almost impossible to resist the temptation, right?
Of course, no. It is nice to indulge in some hypocrisy calling
out. Doesn't this feel just like that the celebrity I take responsibility video, except sort of from the other direction, where it's like your opinion is unsolicited. No one asked for it. Maybe some people like this. I don't know. Maybe some people want to. I shouldn't say that it's unsolicited. It's certainly unsolicited from me, and I wouldn't be reading it if you hadn't sent it to me. But
yeah. Well, it's unsolicited, but like, I don't know. Why should that matter? Like, I mean, the Twitter is full of unsolicited opinions. Like,
that's true. Maybe it's a stupid argument, but
it's like, I've heard that argument as well, by the way, like this unsolicited thing. It's like, I don't care. I didn't want to hear what like J.K. Rowling thought of this. And it's like, and then they're saying that on Twitter. It's like, I didn't care about your opinion about that either. Like, I don't know. Unsolicited opinions are what Twitter is.
I have a few people I follow on Twitter that are on this list, but they're only on there for like the eye roll factor. So I noticed Jonathan Haidt.
Oh yeah, I don't mind Jonathan Haidt.
He's an eye roller for me. And same with David Brooks. I think he's a New York Times columnist, but they brought him in because he was the not Trump conservative. And then he writes all this shit about like refinding his faith after getting divorced and stuff like that. So very boomer self-help.
It's funny. Sorry, go ahead.
They have some younger people though. Like Coleman Hughes, he's a writer for Quillette. He's at Columbia, and his primary focus is on race and racial reparations, right? He's probably only about like 22, 23. He signed the letter.
Oh yeah. Yeah. He's an interesting guy.
Yeah.
Coleman Hughes.
Now, I think actually what we should do, just to kind of move the conversation along a little bit and actually kind of foreground our discussion of power, is what do people think about the kind of implicit moral assumption in this, which is that deliberation and debate will allow the best arguments to come to the fore and will enable us to speak truth to power? Because there are these really kind of Millsian undertones to this piece, right? Which is, well, if you allow a free flow of different arguments in the marketplace of ideas, the best arguments will ultimately prevail and individuals will be convinced by them and society will move forward. And this has always been extremely useful for people in marginalized communities. And I should say I'm committed to this ideal, right? I think that we need more public deliberation, right? And we need better communication and dialogue and so forth. But I do also think it's really naive. And I know some of the authors there, like Noam Chomsky, I've written a lot about this, right? To assume that if you just allow people to talk, the better argument will always carry the day. And I can't think of any instance in history where that's happened. Going back to somebody like Socrates, right? Socrates had better arguments for why it is that they shouldn't execute him. And the Athenians went ahead and did it anyway.
Yeah.
Right? And I think the same is true today, maybe even more so, right? I mean, there are all kinds of instances I can think of where I've thought, well, this person had a better argument. The public seems convinced by someone else. Probably just because the other person was more famous or they had more attention or they were more rhetorically flashy or what have you.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think that like when it comes to this question of, of course, it's a fantasy that if people have more information and more opportunities to debate, they're going to, the best argument's going to win the day. I mean, there's so many factors. But I guess I would still say that it's certainly better than the alternative, right? Because the alternative would be that some centralized power is controlling the narrative. So like, it's not so much... For me, it's not so much that, if we have, that I believe in this fantasy, like, if there's free debate, then we're going to have the best ideas. Like, no, of course not. Like human beings are fallible and idiots, and there's a lot of 20-year-olds who are stupid, as we talked about last podcast, right? And it's just,
dude, there's way too many 20-year-olds. Way too many.
Exactly. So it's just like people are stupid and they're not.
And then when the 20-year-olds when they get horny, then they just start watching Jordan Peterson on YouTube.
so the point, like, so obviously I don't believe in that fantasy, but to me, it's not about that. It's not about whether that's plausible or not. It's more about, well, what's the alternative? And the alternative seems worse to me.
Yeah.
Which is presumably that you have something controlling debates, and that just seems obviously worse.
No, I completely agree with you, right? I mean, the notion that there'd be some state committee or academic committee even, right, that adjudicated what is worthy of hearing and what is not worthy of hearing seems really frightening to me, right? And pretty reprehensible in a lot of respects,
to me, that's
right?
the only end of a manifesto like this. Like, they just want everyone to read it and go, oh yeah, if we stop canceling people, then the better ideas will come forward. Or you're saying, okay, let's get an apparatus in here to make sure that people are defended from being fired by WestJet for being racist or whatever.
Well, which is exactly why this statement is like kind of lacking a little bit, because it's just lacking a little bit because it maybe it does buy into too much a bit of that fantasy. Because I certainly doubt that anybody on this list would support some centralized committee, like making sure that people don't get fired for whatever.
We can look forward to next week and kind of what I had prepared for talking about today, and that's about power. People think that power is this, floating miasma of something that one group has and that one person doesn't have. But the only possible time, this is like Foucault's main insight, the only time you have power is in very particular interactions that sort of develop into a large pattern or an institution. So saying something like this is useless, in my opinion. There's no prescription for changing any particular mechanism, anything that brings power about. They're whining about the power of the Twitter mob, and there's only one way to curtail the power of the Twitter mob, and that would be legislation.
Do you think that's the only way?
Well, unless Twitter's going to start banning people, but that would be diametrically opposed to Twitter's interest.
Well, the tides of opinion do change from time to time. Like, I think, but you're right. This alone does nothing, but I don't know.
Yeah. And I should say there is an irony implicit within the letter itself, right? Which is that a lot of the people who signed it also made sure that they included their academic credentials or other designations of professional expertise, right? They didn't just rely on the substance of what they were saying to make their case for them. What they're essentially saying is, we're important people. Here's why we're important. And this means that you should take what we're saying to have some kind of authority. Right.
Well, we can't really decide whether they decided to include those, right? It might have been
Well, then Harper's did, right? I mean, I don't have a problem with that, right? But it does speak to the kind of Foucaultian point that you're making, right? Which is that, it's very difficult to extricate the conditions of power from any kind of discourse, right? Which is why I also think, while we should certainly emphasize the importance of rational communication and dialogue, we should always be aware that there are many different ways in which communication and dialogue and reason can be distorted by power, by ideology, and all that other kind of nasty stuff that we talk about.
I'm also curious, reading the names on this list, I was thinking to myself, there are definitely some people who would have signed this whose names aren't on here. And I wonder if that's intentional, right? Like, because they do, for example, Jordan Peterson, right? Like, yeah. So like, I'll bet you that was an intentional. It's like, we don't want his name on here. Or I don't know, Sam Harris, maybe. I didn't actually check hard enough to see if he wasn't on there, but I would imagine that there's certain names that are maybe that they don't want to be associated with. And they're like, yeah, let's not even offer those people to sign it.
Yeah. The most outspoken people whose brand is only this thing are not included on here because they don't like that their brand is only that thing. Exactly.
No, that's a really good observation. Yeah. I mean, really, Coleman Hughes is probably the one who's closest associated with that most closely associated with that since his primary thing is writing for Colette. And I think he's at a center-right think tank right now.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I can't imagine that Noam Chomsky or Drusilla Cornell or Samuel Moyne would really want to align themselves with those kind of IDW types, right?
Exactly. So obviously Ben Shapiro's not on here, and I'm sure he would have signed it. I'm sure Dave Rubin would have signed it. I'm sure all those people would have signed this.
Fuck, you probably got to go on Fan Molyneux to sign it, right?
Yeah, probably, yeah.
But that really speaks to what's actually being said here, the subtext, and the subtext is really a defense of their very particular class interest in terms of this literati intelligentsia class and what they see as normal. And their normal is being solicited and their opinions being sought out, which is also just blatant self-interest. And I don't know if you could call that conservative. I guess it's sort of conservative in the sense that they're trying to return to normalcy. But this is
no. But I think you're right. I think it is appealing to some sort of like norm of maybe like, in some ways, to me, it's almost like let's not forget the values of Berkeley in 1968 or something like that. The open debate and challenging authority with debate.
Yeah, last time that we talked. Victor, I brought up Alan Bloom, The Closing of the American Mind. So this sounds exactly like his chapter because he's freaking out about black activists at University of Chicago in the 60s. Like in the 60s, this was
although Alan Bloom has an agenda, which is not one necessarily of open debate.
His son Francis Fukuyama's on here.
No, it's the other way. Oh yeah, his son. Yeah, his son is on here. Yeah, Francis Fukuyama. Yeah.
No, but I mean. This is the one problem that I had with the article, right? And I think we all kind of agree that, freedom of speech, open dialogue, opinion, trying to make rational arguments, all that's extremely important, right? And, to a certain extent, we're all committed liberals that way. The problem that I had with, I mean liberal in the broad sense, not necessarily liberal in the sense that you support X, Y, or Z policy, right? But, but what I think is problematic with this is that if you're going to try to make the argument that we need to maintain a tradition of liberal open-mindedness and dialogue and a robust public sphere, then that's fine. But then you should also try to engage in in-depth analysis of why a lot of those mores aren't appealing to people any longer. And there are a huge number of dimensions to that critical theory, to come back to the theme of this podcast, can actually open up for you. And what I find problematic about a lot of these people, not all of them, because I think Noam Chomsky, Drusilla Cornell, Samuel Moyn, all do good work on this thing. But a lot of the authors that I see there just don't even bother doing that. They're just like, well, we should maintain this norm of liberal openness and nothing has really changed since the 19th century. People communicate more or less the same way that they used to. And if we just got back to what worked for timeless centuries, then everything would be hunky-dory. And my kind of argument is, well, no, times have changed. And if you want to talk about maintaining liberal norms, then you also need to talk about how to rejuvenate them and make them relevant in a digital era, right? Where there are new forms of power that interfere with communication.
Yeah, I think that's the material analysis here, is this is all a reaction to media technology, because all other modes of communication are now media technology, right? If you read a book, you're tweeting excerpts and tweeting the title. And if you write an article, you have to tweet to it, you have to link to it. The only way to be published at all is to do it through these digital media.
Yeah. Like, I almost want to invoke Adorno here, right? Steven Pinker is one of the signatories to this letter, right? And he's famous for his endorsement of Enlightenment reason and how things are always getting better. And he says, I can't understand why people are rejecting the Enlightenment en masse. It seems like a return to unreason. And I think we have to insist here on the Adornian point, which is that, reason has, or Enlightenment reason, liberal reason as it was articulated in the 19th century, has pretty serious problems inherent within it. And that doesn't mean we need to reject it, but it means that we need to look at what those problems are seriously and in depth, and then try to find a way to reconstruct and rejuvenate them for the 21st century, rather than just by saying, well, things were great back then, why don't we just return to the way things were, right? Which is what
that is a fucking brilliant point. I think we should bring that up pretty early next time, and especially when Born is here, because Adorno and Horkheimer's dialectic is basically blaming Hegel, more or less, but Kant Hegel, for the unreason of the Enlightenment. But this is really my area of critical theory, and I think Eric's, who's not here, but pointing out those internal contradictions that maintain the whole normative system. And this is an argument, this article is an argument to maintain normalcy, a normalcy which happens to be benefiting them. I don't want to say we should dismiss it because it's hypocritical, but this normalcy is benefiting them, so it's in their self-interest to defend it.
Yeah, right.
Take somebody like Habermas or Horkheimer or Axel Honneth, right? Any of these people who are really about renewing communication and renewing reason and rejuvenating it in the 20th and 21st century, right? None of them would just say, like Pills talking about, right? Well, what we need is a return to normalcy, and if we just go back to the Enlightenment, everything will be fine, right? Which Chomsky also sometimes applies, right? What they say is the Enlightenment had some seriously shitty problems inherent within it. There was an emancipatory kernel to this idea of reason as a liberating force, but the project is not completed yet because the material conditions and the cultural conditions in which we live are always going to warp reason and dialogue in ways that aren't beneficial, right? And I just sometimes find that a lot of these analyses don't really try to tackle any of that, right? They just have this kind of nostalgic vision of what life was like back then.
Well, I mean, I just echo a lot of what you guys are saying. I don't really have all that much to add, other than like I think it's certainly like a debate that like continues to frustrate, just because I think, but like in some ways the extremes of both sides of the like so-called wokeness versus non-wokeness debate are so loud. So like everything we've been saying, like, it's just that's frustrating because they're the loudest, and both of them kind of distort the reality of what's actually happening and make it seem like a lot more of a severe situation than maybe I think it is. Even though, like, as an academic myself, I would say it maybe seems the most real to people who are actually in academia, because that's still where it comes up more often. Maybe you guys would disagree, but I feel like that's where it seems most real, potentially.
Sorry, can I ask you something, Victor? This is something actually I think we should all address. What do we think is a good model for reason, dialogue, and open debate? And let's not say this podcast or the three of us, right? You know, is there somebody out there we could point to, like, who does open, reasonable, interesting debate about complicated issues well?
Sorry, my internet cut out for a second there.
I said, who can we think of a model outside of this podcast?
You are my model, Matt. I would never go talk to those people ever.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. But no, outside of this, can we point to someone of prominence, right, that dialogues and presents constructive arguments about what's going on, doesn't kind of eschew complexity, and can kind of serve as a model for how to engage in a reasonable debate in the 21st century?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. It's a really good question. I mean, I agree. I certainly agree with Pills that you certainly do a good job.
Thanks.
But yeah, I mean, who's engaged?
Zizek is the famous one that I don't really disagree with most of what he says.
I agree with
that. I don't think he censors himself for it.
Yeah.
Although like the reason, oh God,
shit.
Someone fucking internet.
Did you ask that question because you have someone in mind?
No, actually, I was going to say Zizek as well. So you beat me to that, right? I mean, I think he does a really good job of bringing things down to earth, and he does absolutely 100% engage with his political opponents. Pretty much engages with everybody, right?
My internet just keeps on cutting out here for a second, but I'm back.
Yeah, we're still in storm zone.
I guess we're still in storm.
So Matt actually agreed and said Zizek.
Yeah, Zizek's good. Although the one thing that's like could be sometimes frustrating about him is he might like refuse, which also may be a good thing about him. Actually, he'll kind of refuse to argue the point.
Yeah, but like you've seen thousands of times how futile it is to argue the point,
sure.
especially against that brand of intellectual dad web people.
Yeah.
I think we should talk about this again. We weren't prepared for it, so we didn't have any like interesting quips or actually theoretical background to bring it. Oh, I should speak for myself. I didn't know we were going to talk about this.
Neither did I.
But it's an interesting topic. To me, it doesn't really matter all that much. I'd rather create spaces for speaking rather than complain about the spaces that I have to talk to people I don't like in.
Maybe your opinion will change after we get canceled.
There you go.
I wouldn't even know if we got canceled though. Like I don't have Twitter notifications.
Yeah, that's true.
Matt would. We have to protect Matt.
I guess the only circumstance when it would actually matter is if somehow this podcast got big enough or we had paid sponsors and then we started losing sponsors because people like rallied them.
What do we say that's offensive?
I don't think we say anything that's offensive. I'm just saying you never know. Times are changing.
Like if we got canceled for something that we said so far, I would be shocked.
Because we laugh at people's like kind of like sort of absurdity, and they're like sometimes we'll laugh at certain groups as like irrationality or unreasonableness. I don't know.
I guess 20-year-olds.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only
canceled by 20-year-olds.
I think the only condition which would happen is honestly like kind of like a James Gunn scenario. Somebody dragged up something we said back in the day and used that to try to hit us over the head with.
Bro,
right?
I have been on Twitter for 10 years. And before I started posting,
You've been on for
before
10
I started
years?
posting YouTube videos, I had like 5 tweets. It was 1 tweet every 2 years average.
Yeah.
Anyway, we hope you don't get canceled, Matt. We're gonna do our best to defend you out there.
Since you actually have a job too.
Yeah, well, only for the first year. Then once you get like tenure track official, then you can say whatever you want. So
There you go.
So this is only the start of a discussion. More to come. We're moving into a series on power, as I've probably mentioned twice already. But it's going to end up in Marx, because I think we need to establish our position on Marx. Because if we want to have a position on the Twitter land, everyone there has a hot take on Marx, and I think he might be a little bit overrated, and I think you might be putting too much stock into his relevance today. Not that he's overrated for his own time. I would never say that.
Yeah.
But I think saying, we can just parallel one-to-one apply Marxian ideas into the conditions that we are witnessing. Nobody says that. Not even Lenin said that. So we're going to do Marx.
Cool.
With people who know Marx better than I.
Definitely better than me.
Oh, yeah, fuck. But better than like 99.99% of Marxists out there.
That'll be useful.
So.
All right. So here we'll say goodbye from Matt, our, what did I call you again? You're an inquisitor. Oh, radical. You're a radical left inquisitor paladin. And of course, the bard.
Thank you. Yes.
I think you should do some lectures, and then we'll post them up as like sleep aids.
Who, me?
Yeah, just you. Just reading. Or you could just do reading, just like read.
I should read Marx's Capital.
Yeah, or John Stuart Mill.
Yeah.
Just read it in your. I don't know how to describe it. Your base.
I could whisper. We could do like an ASMR.
Oh, that's a hot search term on YouTube.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, we should do it. We could put it up on our second YouTube channel.
We should start. Are you gonna put that up yet or what?
It'll happen.
Okay.
People are asking for it, and you're asking for it most of all. So
it's a good idea. I think it's a good idea. Cool. That was fun.
Anyway,
even though
guys,
it's kind of ad hoc, but it was fun.
Be careful for the lightning outside if you're in the city. And Matt, be careful of America.
Are you in America right now?
No, I'm still in Ottawa for another month.
Be careful of Ottawa then. Yeah.
Yeah, be careful.
You don't want too many people to see you on the street in Ottawa. You never know what can happen.
And Ottawa's like the safest motherfucking city in the entire goddamn world, right? Like,
no, I mean swag around a little bit too hard out there
for supporting their charity.
The charity, or they'll pull you into an alley trying to bribe you. You know, offer to hook you up with a pedophile ring. There's anything could happen in there.
Cool.
All right, goodbye, guys.
Should we start the stop? Yeah, see ya.
Peace.